Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Nanja-san, for having me here. I'm delighted to be talking in front of this audience. The topic we have before us today is, what is it that you design? This was the question that was posed to me. And I realized that before we get to what is it that you design, I want to look at the question, who is it that designs? Who is it that actually decides what our cities are and what they're going to be over the next few years? Because historically, the design of our cities has been done by architects, often working alone, solitary figures, usually men, not women, who work to create the city that the rest of us simply inhabit. Increasingly, though, we're presented with what's known as the smart city paradigm. And this is a photo from the control room in Rio de Janeiro, which was created actually in partnership with IBM. And so this vision of the smart city sees data deciding what it is that we do in the city, algorithms deciding what we do in the smart city, AI determining how we live and what we are supposed to be doing in the smart city. And what I would like to ask is that in this kind of vision of the city, which is determined largely through processes of observation, surveillance, who gets to decide how those decisions are made? Because this is the smart city, but this is also the smart city. The algorithms that are behind the decisions that go into determining things like traffic flow and pedestrian flow, the monitoring, is also the same type of algorithm that goes into deciding to deploy troops into the slums to clear them. So this is the smart city as much as this is the smart city. Not only that, but this is also the smart city. Facebook being able to generate hundreds of millions of pounds of revenue in the UK, pay £35 million in staff bonuses, but pay a minuscule amount of taxes. It's part of the same process. The Ashley Madison leak is also part of the smart city. The idea that masses of personal data that's stored on the network through somebody's mistake or somebody's decision gets released into the wild. And Volkswagen being able to falsify their emissions experiments. This too is the smart city. And I want to explain that when we are talking about the use of technology to design and determine how our cities function, this also will be a feature of the smart city. So the way we decide, the decisions that we're making today, especially the people that are making those decisions on our behalf, have this capacity to reach more people than ever before, at a distance that's greater than before, and to last and impact for a much longer time than ever before. So I also want to just show you this clip, which is from Portugal. It was a Volvo demonstration of an automatically, what do you call it, a sort of a self-parking vehicle. So there's no driver driving, the car is parking itself. So it pulls back and it's now going to pull in to park itself. Now, what was interesting was that that Volvo explained afterwards that they had forgotten to implement the pedestrian safety function for the parking. Now, what I find most interesting about this clip, which was actually quite a popular one a few weeks ago, is look at the people on the left. They trusted the technology so implicitly that they actually trusted it more than their own perception. And I think that this is an important thing to understand, that when we have algorithms making decisions on our behalf, and when they are not transparent, and we simply have to believe them, then we, more often than not, start to mistrust our own capacity to make decisions ourselves about our cities and about the way we live in them. And we start to mistrust ourselves. And this is only furthered by, for example, a Google engineer recently said in talking about autonomous vehicles, he described people, human beings, as bugs in the system. So the question is, who gets to design the way these systems are deployed? Is it IBM that gets to design the infrastructures of our cities and design how those cities are created and formulated? Who is it that decides what efficiency and optimization and predictability and security are in the city? Who is it that decides what appropriate behavior is in the city? These are questions that fundamentally concern me, because as we are entering into far more complex situations, what I'm finding is that there is a tendency, on the one hand, not to say, okay, now we can all design these things together, but rather that we humans, maybe we're not good enough at designing and we need to turn those processes over to a machine. What I'm actually interested in is finding ways that we can all decide together, to build those kinds of platforms for participation that are enabling us to make decisions collectively. Now, this means building connections, it means building networks, it means building platforms, and ultimately it means building neighborhoods. I don't believe necessarily that crowdsourcing results in better decisions or in better data or in a better outcome, but I do believe that when we are all involved in making those decisions together, that we are much more invested in the results of those decisions, we're much more responsible for the outcomes of those decisions, and we're much more likely to implement what is needed to get us out of the kind of mess that we're in, especially when we see the concerns that we have about, for example, climate change. Now, we find, for example, that in climate science, we citizens, ordinary citizens, are largely dependent on trusting the opinions of scientists or religious figures or politicians or media figures. I say that we need to find ways to design the systems through citizens come together to question those standards of evidence, to be part of the process of making sense of what's going on, and to decide collectively what it is that we do in response to them, rather than abdicating that responsibility to experts to make those decisions on our behalf. It's really the only way that we're going to collectively come together and actually enact the consequences of those decisions. So by way of examples of the way that these kinds of thought processes have kind of manifested in my work, I'm just going to go through very briefly a few projects here. I start with Pachbe, which was perhaps my better known initiative here in Japan. It was early on one of the first data infrastructures and communities for Internet of Things data. It was, if you like, a kind of a web repository of data from everything from air quality monitors to weather stations to radiation monitors to seismographs, contributed by members of the public around the world. In 2011, it was actually used a lot here in Japan following the radiation crisis at Fukushima. Well, what I found interesting about this was that there were many, many people that were plugging in their radiation monitors and Geiger counters and pushing that data to the platform in order to make it available to others. And there was quite a lot of criticism about whether this was dirty data. It was uncalibrated, it was supposedly unscientific. But what was actually going on was it was members of the public wanting to measure themselves and be part of that process of trying to make sense. They were not trying to create an objectively quantifiable data set. They were concerned with whether the radiation numbers were going up or were they going down. They weren't trying to do a perfectly calibrated data set. And so this was an example for me of people using the process of measurement, not using data, but using the process of measurement to make sense of what was going on and actually be part of the process of making decisions about it. Linguine was a project that I did about 5 years ago in Bradford in North England. Now, Linguine was basically a project to build an operating system, just like you have in a computer, your Mac operating system, Windows operating system, or even better, the Linux operating system. So too did we try here to create an operating system for the built environment. So connecting up things like the sensors in the street, the lights, the fountains, the lasers, the LEDs in the floor, the weather station, the cameras, and make it very easy for the council to script the way all of these things were connected to each other, but to be able to change that on the fly, so that if they wanted to make the fountains respond to people walking, they simply had to drag and drop from the camera to the fountain. If they want the lights to respond to people, they can create different interaction paradigms. But more importantly, the process we're going through now is to open that up so that members of the public using a mobile phone can actually connect up all this urban furniture, urban sensors to each other and design their own interactive systems in the city. So essentially what this was looking at was the idea that actually ordinary members of the public can configure the way the city responds to them rather than simply inhabiting the city that somebody else has designed on their behalf. Natural Fuse was a project from 2009, which was basically a plant with a power socket. The idea of this project was that the amount of energy that was available at the socket was limited by the capacity of the plant to offset its carbon footprint. The idea being that if you plug something into it, you can offset the carbon footprint of the device that you plug into it, so that you can be neutral, carbon neutral. The thing is that even a low wattage lamp needs 6 plants to offset its carbon footprint. So all of these plants were connected over the network, and they all knew each other's state. So when you switch on your natural fuse, it wakes up and checks out on the network to see if there are 5 other plants out there that are not currently being used. And if there are, then you have enough carbon sequestering capacity in the network to borrow that you can switch on your light and it remains carbon neutral as a collective. You can decide whether to be selfless or selfish. If you're selfless and there are not enough plants available on the network, then the natural fuse will switch off your plant before harming the network. So, for example, if there are only 3 plants available on the network, then your light might switch off after a couple of minutes before it harms the carbon footprint of the community. But you can decide also to be selfish. And if you decide to be selfish, then you switch it on and you get as much energy as you need, which you might need to. Perhaps you heard an intruder in your apartment and you absolutely had to have light on. You switch it to selfish and you get as much energy as you need. But if you harm the carbon footprint of the community, then it sends out a kill signal to kill somebody else's plant. And it does this with a vinegar injection. Now, in practice, what we do is we give every plant 3 lives, a little bit like a video game. And every time it loses a life, then both the killer and the killee get an email, and they can engage in a dialogue about why they had to be selfish and what was happening. You know, I heard somebody coming into my flat, and I had to have light. And the idea here is that we're building a system that incentivizes a collective approach to decision-making around carbon sequestering, but it doesn't require selfless behavior. You can be selfish if necessary, and when you are selfish, there is accountability for the decision that you make. In other words, you are part of a discussion with other people to explain the selfish processes. And I think this is an important part of almost any participatory system, is to think about how do you account for both the selfless and the selfish behavior within the system. Open Burble, which Nanjo-san actually commissioned back in 2006 for Singapore, was a project that was essentially looking at how ordinary members of the public could come together to create something much larger than themselves, much larger than they're used to creating on an urban scale. And I ended up designing this kind of module of carbon fiber structures, approximately 2 meters in diameter, filled with balloons and sensors and things like that. And people could come along and start to design and assemble kind of structures out of this very lightweight system, attach them together, start to inflate the balloons, and then finally, I have some video here, erect it into a structure 18 stories tall. So you could see roughly how tall it is there. The idea being that ordinary members of the public designed this structure, they built it, they erected it, and they then controlled it in real time in public space, possibly changing the skyline for the first time in their lives. Now, it only lasted one night, but the point was that I was looking to enable people to sort of take over a sense of ownership of this thing, to feel that it was theirs, that they had actually contributed to the wider experience. I was very gratified to see some blog posts later on that referred to this project not as an art project, not as an architecture project, not even as something that I myself had done, but what they had done. So here, somebody's referring to it as my baby up there. Somebody else sent me this, which was their scrapbook about their kind of involvement in the project themselves. Again, it was about that sort of sense of ownership that other people have when they take on something and they design something themselves. More recently, Thinkful.net is something that my team and I launched at the end of 2013, which is basically a search engine for the Internet of Things. We now have millions of sensor devices deployed around the world, many of which are actually generating public data. So just like Patch Bay was 5, 6, 7 years ago, now there are dozens, if not hundreds, of these networks of devices, weather stations, air quality monitors, seismographs, radiation sensors, ships, planes, cars, icebergs. There's even animals available. And what we do is we go out and we index all of these infrastructures, and we present it in a way that's easy for others to find the data that they're looking for. So if you're looking for radiation in Germany, for example, you can find all of the radiation monitors, and you can actually access the data from those devices. You can either get a preview on Thinkful, or more likely, you go to the original source for the data itself. Part of the reason for doing this is that if, for example, you as an ordinary member of the public are concerned about air quality, you probably don't know about the Air Quality Egg network, or the AQICN network, or perhaps your local city's air quality network. But these are deployed around the world, and if you Google for air quality in your neighborhood, you won't find those devices. You might find an article about air quality in your city, which is written possibly months or even years ago. But to find the actual device that's generating the data that you can make sense of and make decisions of, which might even be in your neighbor's home that they've decided to make public, is almost impossible. And so ultimately what this is about is making it much easier for ordinary people to make use of data that's already out there, that's already public, that has already been made open by the owners of those devices. And I took a screenshot just before coming of Tokyo to have a look at what's available near us right now. And I'm just going to finish with Flight Path, a project that I did in Toronto in collaboration with the artist and engineer Natalie Jeremijenko about 4 years ago. I was commissioned to look at an event in downtown Toronto that would involve 100,000 people. And I thought this was a wonderful opportunity to try and re-script urban transportation, rapid transportation in the city center. And what we ended up proposing was to use zip lines to connect up the different locations in the city center. So zip lines, I'm hoping this is getting translated. A zip line is what has been used for thousands of years in mountains, just a cable and gravity to transport people and goods and food and all these sorts of things. And so what we did is we set up these zip lines all over the city center so that people could use them to travel around the city center. They're fast, they're fun, they're emissionless. In other words, they have a zero carbon footprint. And most interestingly for me, you can actually deploy them and redeploy them very quickly. So what we did was we actually trained ordinary members of the public in using these zip lines, gave them wings to fly like birds, and deployed these around the city center. What's kind of interesting about this process was to look at how to involve communities in deciding where their transportation networks should be, which locations should you connect up, and most importantly, to be able to prototype rapidly in the urban environment a kind of a transportation system that might fail in one location, but that could be very quickly changed and put in another location. I think this is an important part of any kind of participatory platform for the urban environment, figuring out how to build on previous failures. And this, of course, is not the way one normally thinks about designing for the city. One normally thinks you have to get it right the first time. And therefore, it takes 20 years to make a decision. What we're looking at with this project was how can we try things out very quickly, get people to actually experience them, and build a shared memory of a possible future, and actually be invested in the decisions that are made about how we travel, where we travel, and why we travel. So I thought I'd just wrap up with some of the kind of lessons I've taken from building these kinds of participatory platform. First, when designing any kind of participatory platform, you can't rely on the end goal being enough of a reason for people to cooperate in the project. So, for example, in the Natural Fuse project, the end goal, even though at a meta level it might be to do with energy conservation or reducing carbon footprint, that alone is not enough to convince people to participate in the network. Actually, the Natural Fuse units themselves also watered the plant. So many people just used it because it was an automatic plant waterer. We've done it in many parts around the world, in Seoul, in Sydney, in Dublin, in New York, and had quite a few people use it around the world. But you can't rely on that end goal being enough. Instead, you need to sort of design the system so that incremental participation gets you those incremental gains. In other words, not everybody agrees on everything to begin with. The agreement can come later, the consensus can come later, but there needs to be some way for people to experiment with and even buy into the system without necessarily agreeing on everything. There's also something about making data public. But more important than simply making data public, I think, is the public making the data, being part of that process of measuring the environment, deciding about the environment, and then taking action on the environment. And a public spectacle is sometimes a good way to do this because it doesn't require any long-term commitment, but it does enable people to observe and ask questions and then decide whether or not to participate. One of the things I found is that when you have a truly participatory project, it becomes so complex that no single person can actually fully describe what's going on. Thank you very much.